I'm so excited to join you guys today to talk about no more crickets in our ESL classroom. So just to give you a little bit of background on me, I have a PhD in linguistics, but my focus for research is second language acquisition. So how do we learn languages and what do we actually know and learn when we learn a new language? Um, but in addition to that, I have been teaching for about 30 years. So, in terms of language teaching, I've mostly been a Spanish and ESL instructor. So, I taught Spanish in K-12 in Florida and in Texas, and then at UC San Diego while I was working on my PhD, I taught Spanish there as well. And then I taught ESL internationally in Guatemala and in Papua New Guinea. And then also to adult learners in Dallas, in El Paso, and in San Diego. Um, Starting in 2009, I changed my focus a little bit and became a college professor. So I worked at the University of Texas at Arlington for about 15 years as a professor of linguistics and TESOL. And I really kind of found my passion there with TESOL. I love training teachers. I love helping teachers figure out how to do things differently in their classroom. And I really love helping ESL teachers figure out how to get their students talking and communicating and actually using the language. I've also been an administrator while I was at UT Arlington. I was the director of the English Language Institute. But in 2024, I had the opportunity to move to Stephen F. Austin State University, which is in deep East Texas, where I'm now the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. And in that capacity, I get to work with faculty across the entire university. And I love what I do. I love teaching, and I welcome you as we go through to ask your questions. And I'll be giving you some opportunities to chat with me and with each other as well. So let's just talk really quickly about where we're headed today. So, our goal today is to think strategically about how to get our ESL students talking and communicating. We're going to focus on questions in order to think about this. So I'm going to deal with different kinds of questions that we can use in our classrooms. And I'm also going to deal with what to do when nobody answers them and you get crickets in your classroom. Ultimately, I'll give you 6 tips to consider when asking questions. And throughout, I'll be using some examples from Venture's fourth edition, which is available and shipping on June 1st and has some great new features for you. So let's chat for just a minute. So I want you just to think for a second and answer either one of these questions. Why are your students studying English? And why do we as teachers want to get them talking? Why are they studying English? Why do we want to get them talking? Oh, to get a better job. Hearing that from several people. Job opportunities. Oh, to help their kids study, to communicate better, better jobs. So I'm seeing several people mention communication, and I'm gonna move forward with that. Feel free. I'm seeing so many great answers in the chat, but let's talk about communication. So what's communication? So communication technically is imparting or exchanging information or news. We do this every day. Anytime we're talking with anybody, there's an exchange of information or news. But in order to have successful communication, I want us to think about what it is that we need to know. So, what do you have to know in order to know a language? So, you have to know vocabulary. You have to be able to have some words that you know, and you have to be able to put them together. So we have to know some syntax so that we can string our sentences together. We also need to know how words and pieces of words fit together. So we have to know morphology. We have to know how do we change an ending on a word to make it past tense. We also need to know about pronunciation. How do we actually say the words of a language? I see somebody in the chat who said pragmatics, and you are absolutely right. Pragmatics is so important. We're going to be talking about context throughout. Listening, right? If you can't listen and understand what somebody's saying, it's hard for communication to be happening. And with all of these things that I have so far on the screen, so many of these things we practice and we drill and we take quizzes to learn vocabulary, and we put words in the right places, and we know whether or not we know past tense or plurals or things like that. And in our language classes, we practice these a lot. But I want us to think about pushing past just practicing these discrete skills and really getting into helping our students learn about speaking, because lots and lots of students know a lot of things about their second language. But if we can't actually communicate, then can we really say that we know that language? So on the screen, you see my husband's 819-day streak. Guys, that is more than 2 years of Duolingo learning Spanish. And I'll say sometimes, hey, babe, do you want to practice Spanish with me? And he says, oh no, I don't speak Spanish well enough to practice with you. But he knows all these other things. He knows the vocabulary and the syntax and morphology and pronunciation and listening, but he doesn't actually sit down and speak face to face with someone and practice having all that stuff he knows come out of his brain and to a real person. He needs to practice his speaking, but he thinks he doesn't know enough to do those. So yes, we work on all of these all the time. We teach them formulas of how language works, but we don't just want to teach those things and the formulas. We want to give students opportunities to practice those things. So why and when do we ask questions? So there are lots of reasons why we ask questions. So sometimes we're asking questions for information. Hey, what time does the library close? Or we ask questions for connection. Maybe we say, hey, oh, that's a gorgeous blouse. Where did you get that? Right? That's a connection strategy. Sometimes in a classroom, we ask for assessment, right? We want to know what our students know. We ask questions for getting to know each other, but I want to focus in on this psychological safety issue. So back in 1982, Stephen Krashen published Principles and Practices in Second Language Acquisition, and he dealt with this concept called the affective filter. And the affective filter basically proposes that language learners have sort of a natural barrier that filters things out when they're not comfortable. So when students are stressed or anxious or scared or worried, or maybe they didn't eat that morning, all of those things work together to raise this barrier, this affective filter that makes it hard for students to learn languages. So the point of that is that when we are learning a language, when we are teaching a language, what we want to do is we want to lower that barrier, because as we lower that barrier, now our students can better learn and we can actually help them learn the language if they're comfortable. So a lot of what we do in our classroom, and part of what I'll be talking about today throughout, is this idea that we want to create a safe classroom space for our students with the questions that we ask, so that our students feel safe in our classroom and they're better able to learn the language. So think about this. I want you to actually answer in the chat. So why don't students answer questions? We ask questions all the time. I'm sure you do as a teacher. Why don't students answer them? Fear of being wrong. They feel shy. Those barriers, that affective filter. I'm seeing lots of afraid, fear. They're shy, right? They don't have the confidence. Oh, they don't think they know enough. Oh, they're intimidated. Maybe they think their pronunciation is not as good as it should be. There are so many reasons why students don't answer questions. Let's see if you guys got all the ones I put on my slide. So sometimes they just didn't hear you, right? They need you to repeat the question, or maybe they didn't understand it. They don't know the answer. I know someone said that. They're afraid their answer's wrong. Hopefully not the case in our classrooms, but sometimes they're checked out. They're just unmotivated, right? sometimes they're not really sure we're asking a question. So we ask a question and we move on so quickly that they don't have time to answer, so they just assume it wasn't really a question. Sometimes they think someone else will answer, and they think that others will laugh at their answer. So I'm loving all of the comments in the chat. I'm really seeing so many about the environment in the classroom, right? It's really about whether or not our students are comfortable in our classroom. So here's the deal, guys. Questions are hard. They are so necessary for interaction and for communication, but they are hard to get right. And when I say they're hard to get right, I'm not just talking about the answer. Questions themselves are hard to get right. Let's think about why. So one of the easy answers is the scaffolding, okay? So many of you talked about how students feel in the class and whether or not they're comfortable in the class and whether the instructor has created a welcoming environment. But when we think about scaffolding in the classroom, we think about low risk before high risk. So if our students are not comfortable in our classroom and we ask a higher risk question, they're not going to answer us because they're not comfortable, right? It's high risk. They have a lot more room to be embarrassed. They're not going to risk that. Also, we want to think about asking concrete questions before we ask abstract questions. So concrete questions, there's often a yes or no answer. There's a right or wrong answer. And if they know the answer, they can respond. But abstract questions, ooh, sometimes they may not even understand the question, right? So we start with concrete and we build to abstract. And we start with individual reflection where students can think and respond on their own before we throw them out in front of the group. So as we think about wanting our students to interact more, we have to think about low risk, we have to think about concrete, we have to think about individual reflection to start training them to answer questions. And the more they get used to answering questions in class, the more we can push them higher risk and more abstract and more toward group discussion because they're comfortable and they're ready to answer questions. So let's talk about kinds of questions. Now, I'm going to say I'm in Texas. I'm not sure where you are, but it is a little bit after 2 p.m. here. I hope you've already had lunch because you're going to see lots and lots of food on my slides. But before I jump into actually talking about questions, I want to give you a bonus tip. This is tip number 0. If your students are not talking and you have tried all of my tips and you still can't get them talking, talk about food. Everybody eats. Okay, maybe not everybody, but most people I know eat food, right? Everybody has experience with food, and food is a great way to get students talking with each other if you're struggling with other stuff. So think about food. And think about the knowledge that students bring to us when we talk about food. So students can talk about foods from their culture and they become the authority in the classroom. And sometimes ESL students don't feel like they have much authority in our classroom. But yes, Patrick, you're exactly right. People from different cultures love talking about their country's food. So if we, yes, absolutely, wait till after Ramadan to talk about food. I'm so sorry for bringing up food here in my entire presentation. So food is a great motivator to get students talking, sharing meals together, okay, topics that interest them and that are relevant to them. So start with a great topic. That is tip number 0. Let's talk about kinds of questions. So we're going to talk about 3 kinds of questions today. We're going to talk about yes/no questions or closed questions. Like, do you like pizza? It's a yes or a no. We're going to talk about WH or open-ended questions. Who likes pizza? When do you eat pizza? And we're going to talk about tag questions or leading questions. You like pizza, don't you? So let's start with yes/no questions. So as a beginning teacher, I was like, I had so many great questions to ask my students, but many of them were yes/no questions. And I might have tried a question like, hey, do you like Mexican food? And in my mind, my students are going to jump in and they're going to give me lots of information. Yes, I especially like tacos and enchiladas, or maybe they don't and they say, no, I really prefer Italian. How about you? But guys, this is not what happened in my classroom. I would say, do you like Mexican food? And my students would say, yes. Done. Conversation's over. So the problem is that when we're focused on asking yes, no questions, they don't lead to interaction. There's only two answers, okay? Yes or no. But the issue is there's always more to the story. There's always pragmatics that goes with that. There's always context along with that. And we have to define that for students and ask for it, okay? So how do we ask for it? So let me introduce you to what I call the art of the follow-up question. So follow-up question is when you have students and you say, do you like Mexican food? And they say yes. And instead of saying, okay, and moving to the next student, you follow up with questions that allow that student to add more information. So, do you like Mexican food? Yes. Oh, you do? Why do you like it? Oh, you do? Well, what's your favorite dish? Oh, well, tell me about your favorite restaurant. So now they've answered the yes, no, and you follow up with another question to the same student so that they continue talking. So my first tip is anytime you ask a yes, no question, follow it up with an information seeking question. So let's just try that really quickly. Here's my yes, no question. Do you like McDonald's? A student says yes. What is a follow-up question that you can ask that allows that student or invites that student to ask more questions? Or sorry, to talk a little more. What's your go-to order? Oh, when did you try it? What's your favorite combo? Woo, it's going so fast, I can't even read it. How often do you eat McDonald's? Is there McDonald's in your country? Right, so you can bring in those cultural issues. So you always want to have a follow-up question in your back pocket because that student who was only confident enough to say yes or no, when you ask a follow-up question, you invite them to share more with you. So I want you to think about real life follow-up questions for a second. And I want you to imagine this scenario. So I get home after a long day at work. My husband's home, and I say to him, are you hungry? So why am I asking if he's hungry? Do I really care if my husband is hungry? And if he says he is hungry, what's my follow-up question? Melissa Jean, I think you're answering my second question. My follow-up question is, what would you like to eat? What do you want to eat? Do you want McDonald's? If my son is home, it would definitely be McDonald's. What restaurant are you taking me to? That's exactly it. So when I ask this question, I'm not really asking if my husband is hungry. I am meaning, hey, I'm hungry, let's go eat, right? So if he's smart, he says yes, and he follows up and he says, where do you want to go, right? So here's my husband and I at one of our favorite restaurants with our son because he followed up well, right? Here's the thing with follow-up questions. They're very valuable for our students. They help our students practice using language. It helps them better understand the different contexts and the reasons why we're asking these questions, but it also helps them learn to predict what's coming, right? So my husband knows when I ask, are you hungry? He knows me well and he knows I love food and he knows that really what I'm asking is, where are we going to eat? So by using these follow-up questions, it helps our students learn to communicate better. We model those questions with them, and then they learn to use them when they're asking their own questions. One of the things that you'll see, sorry, I went the wrong way. One of the things that you'll see in Ventures 4 are more collaborative worksheets than ever. So one of the the collaborative worksheets that I love in Ventures are the conversation cards. So if you haven't used these, you have a sheet, you print it out, you cut it apart, and every student in your class gets a question. And then they get to walk around and ask questions of their classmates. So it hands them questions to ask. They don't have to think of them themselves. But I want to zoom in on this and show you something really cool about the way that these are made with yes, no questions. So there are 3 yes, no questions on this particular collaborative sheet that I pulled out. Did you cook last weekend? What did you cook? Already, there's a follow-up question built into the sheet. Students don't even have to think of it. It gives it to them, so it helps train them to ask a follow-up question when they have a yes/no question. Did you buy anything online yesterday? What did you buy? Did you eat at a restaurant last week? Where did you eat? So each time you get a yes/no question, you automatically get a follow-up question after it. I love you guys saying in the chat that you love using these. I think these are one of the most valuable activities that we can do in a classroom with students to get them talking to each other and not just to us in the classroom. All right, so all of those follow-up questions, if you noticed, are what we call WH questions or information-seeking questions. And these are words like who, what, when, where, why, how, right? So you see, okay, I'm in Texas and I really do love Mexican food and I especially love tacos. So let's talk tacos. Let's say you want to talk about tacos. What's an information seeking question, a WH question, that you can ask about food? Oh, Julie, I love that you have the WH questions posted in your room and it gives students something that they can look at and use. Okay, what do you like on your tacos? What's your favorite taco? Any other question? Oh, which kind of tacos are your favorite? What's your favorite Mexican? Why do you like tacos? Okay, you can have all kinds of, again, food is great for conversation, right? So when we think about these questions, I gave you some examples here. You gave great ones in the chat. You don't have to worry about mine. But just like with yes, no questions, I always think that when I say, hey, what's your favorite Mexican dish? That people are going to come back with a nice, long, informative answer. Oh, I love tacos, especially carnitas tacos. Oh, they're spicy and delicious, and I just love them. How about you? But again, guys, this is not what happens in a classroom. So we might say to our students, what's your favorite Mexican dish? And they say, tacos. One word, right? Well, this is just like a yes/no question. It doesn't really lend itself to a whole lot of interaction because WH questions in and of themselves don't always build interaction. So you might have to ask a follow-up question. So if you get a one-word answer, you ask a follow-up question. But there's an even bigger problem with WH questions. You say, what's your favorite food? And you get crickets. And I don't mean that their answer is crickets and they like to eat them. I mean, it is silent in your classroom. What's your favorite food? Well, what's going on when you ask a great question and students don't answer you? So there are lots of potential issues. I love, Paulina, that you said too broad. That's exactly the conclusion I'm about to come to. Maybe students don't know what the question means, right? Their English isn't quite there. Maybe they don't know how to say it in English, especially if the favorite food is a cultural food from home. There just might not be an English equivalent that gives the name of that food. So they don't know how to say it, and they think people won't understand if they use the name in their language. Give them a choice between two. Yes, absolutely, Barbara. Maybe they're just too scared to talk. But I think most of the time what's happening is exactly what Paulina said in the chat. They have so many answers in their mind and they're overwhelmed with the possibilities. So when somebody says, hey, what's your favorite food? I go, oh, well, I love ice cream, especially like Bluebell Tin Roof ice cream. Oh, but Chunky Monkey's really good. But I really love tacos. And then also, I really love hummus and baba ganoush. And I can just go on and on and on, right? I just love food. There's just too many answers, too many possibilities, right? So these open-ended questions, especially for lower level students, they just have too many possible options. So what do we do about that? How do we fix that? And I love that some of you are already giving great hints in the chat for what we do. So let me introduce you to the art of the backup question, which is exactly what Barbara pointed to. You give them a choice. So you ask, what's your favorite food? And you get crickets. And you say, oh, that that question was too broad for them. So then I might say something like, well, my favorite food is tacos. Do you like tacos? And now I've handed them a yes, no question. They can say yes or no. And now I can ask a follow-up question, right? Or I might take and give them a 50-50 chance. Do you like tacos or do you like enchiladas? So now there's only two options. They can respond even if they have to guess. Even if they don't know what tacos or enchiladas are, they can say one or the other, right? So they can respond even if they have to guess. I'm not saying it's always a good idea to have students answer questions that they don't know the answer to, but the thing you have to realize is that if we're training them for interaction, the more they answer a question, any question, the more they are likely to continue to answer questions, right? So we want to make sure that we're giving them opportunities to answer questions, and we do that with follow-up questions and with backup questions. Joyce asked in the chat about why questions. Joyce, why is my favorite question for students, especially when I'm teaching grammar or something like that, and they tell me the right answer, and I say, you're correct, now tell me why, right? Because they can guess to get the right answer, but if they can tell me why that's the right answer, then I know that they actually know that grammatical concept. So my second tip is back up. Narrow the field and prepare your students for answering WH questions. So let's try this really quick, just to give you a second of practice. You just ask this question in your classroom, what's your favorite drink? And nobody answers. What's a backup question you can ask? Do you like coffee? I love coffee. I love hot chocolate. Do you like hot chocolate? What do you prefer in the morning? Do you like Coke or Pepsi? Oh, them's fighting words, right? Do you drink it hot or cold? What's in it? There are all kinds of backup questions you can ask when students don't respond to a WH question that you give them. Okay, so my second tip is to back up and prepare students for answering WH questions, as I said. But I want you to understand that this is really good for your students. It helps them better understand the intent of your questions, but these types of questions have so many additional advantages for students. So number one, they help students feel more successful. And the more successful students feel in your class, the more comfortable they are, the more likely they are to be willing to talk. Okay, so they're more willing to talk. Also, the more we train students to talk in these easy situations, the more likely they are to keep talking later. But really, this is about students having the opportunity to experience and practice real life communication. And again, Ventures gives us great ways to do this. So this is another conversation card activity. There are lots of other types of activities. I just love the conversation cards so much that they're sort of my go-to. So if you look at these are all WH questions. So this is actually unit 7 in level 1, which is a shopping unit. This might be level 2. And it's all these WH questions, so students can walk around the room, they can read the question, or eventually, hopefully, hide the question, right? And their classmate answers them. And then maybe they can practice asking a backup question if they need to. So We talked about yes, no questions, and we talked about WH questions, which can be problematic for different reasons, but we can always ask a follow-up question for those or backup question. But tag questions, tag questions are problematic for a totally different reason. So let's just talk about tag questions for a second. So a tag question is something like, you like pizza, don't you? So often we might call a tag question a leading question. So my son used to do this when he was young. He would say, Mommy, can we go to McDonald's? Mommy, we can go to McDonald's, can't we? Right? And he would take my chin and he would nod my head up and down because he's trying to lead me to say yes, right? So there's a funny thing that happens grammatically with tag questions. So when we have a positive statement like you like pizza, there's no negation in there, you get a negative tag. So positive statement gets a negative tag. But if it's a negative statement that already has negation in it, you get a positive tag. So you don't like pizza, do you? Right? Think about this. Now when you ask students a question, you've kind of got two questions or statements going on in the same thing. How do we even answer these? So I'm going to give you an opportunity to take a little quiz. You didn't think you were going to have a quiz today, did you? It might be easy. My question here is I want you to decide. I'm going to give you a question and an answer, and I want you to decide yes or no, does the student like pizza? So here's the first one. You like pizza, don't you? And the student says no. Tell me in the chat, yes or no, does the student like pizza? I'm seeing lots of people say no, and then some people say, I don't know. Ooh, I see a yes. Well, I'm not sure if students like pizza. How about this one? You don't like pizza, do you? Tell me yes or no. Does this student like pizza? Now on this one, I'm saying yes, no, right? Here's the issue, guys. I have been speaking English for over 50 years. And if a student says yes when I say, you don't like pizza, do you? I have no idea if they like pizza. I don't understand what that answer means. So I, as the teacher, don't even know how to interpret what the student said. This is so confusing for me as the teacher, but also for the students in my classroom. So let me introduce you to the art of avoidance. And the art of avoidance, the first point is avoid tag questions. Now, if you're teaching a grammatical lesson on tag questions, there are particular pragmatic instances where we use tag questions. That's not what I'm talking about. If you're wanting students to communicate and to interact and to have a conversation, avoid tag questions because they are confusing. Okay. Also, avoid abstract questions, at least at first. So I see even super experienced teachers come into a classroom where students have been given a reading assignment and say something like, what did you think of the reading? What did I think of the reading? Well, maybe I thought the reading was boring or stupid or incomprehensible. Well, I might think that as a student, but that's really not what we as a teacher are asking. We don't really care what they thought or if they thought it was boring or stupid or incomprehensible. What we care about is that they read. So instead of asking this kind of abstract, what did you think of the reading? We need to start by asking content questions because what we want to know is whether or not they read, right? So who are the main characters? What happened to Susan? Which happened first, right? You can ask those questions. They'll answer the question of whether or not students read instead of asking this very abstract, what did you think of the reading question? You have to train them to get there. And at the beginning of a class or at lower levels, they're probably not ready for that question yet. Now, finally, we also want to avoid unclear questions. So Let's define unclear questions really quickly. What's an unclear question? So here's an example of an unclear question. Do you have any questions? How many of you have ever asked that in your classroom? You don't have to raise your hand because I am positive that pretty much everybody has asked this question before in your classroom. But here's my question for you, and I want you to actually answer this in the chat. Is this example, do you have any questions? Is that a yes, no question, or is that an information seeking question? What do you think? I'm seeing people answering yes, no, and people answering information seeking. And some of you guys, this is the problem. We don't know. This is both. This is both a yes, no question and it's an information seeking question. And so students are like, well, do I say yes or no? Or do I actually tell them my questions? Right? So the problem is that in grammatical form, this is a yes, no question. But in intent, it's an information seeking question. And when grammatical form and intent collide, then sometimes we get crickets because our students don't know what kind of question you're wanting them to answer. Okay. So, what do we do? Instead of asking, do you have any questions? We can ask a different question. Make it clearer. What questions do you have? Here we assume my student has questions. Somebody tell me what question they have, right? What questions do you have? Danielle already put that in the chat. Yeah. What questions do you have about XYZ? What other questions would you ask? I'm going to invite you to put some alternate questions in the chat, and I'm going to tell you a couple more things that I do instead of saying, do you have any questions? So I ask a question to test their knowledge of the content. And Rosemary, you just said this. You ask a specific question about the lesson. So I love grammar. Okay, so if I'm teaching grammar and we've been studying past tense and I want to see if my students know it, instead of saying, okay, do you have any questions? I say, okay, now let's look at 5 verbs and let's put them in past tense. And I actually have them try out the concept. Okay, so I'm seeing lots of great things in the chat. What new thing did you learn today? Can you give me an example? Can you tell me one thing about? Okay, lots of alternative questions instead of just, do you have any questions? One thing that I'm not seeing, which I'm going to add here, is sometimes, depending on the level of my students, I say, everybody write down one question. And then I go gather up all the questions and I use those questions and I actually go through them and I answer them either that class or in the next class. And here's the reason why. There's always students, always students who think their question is stupid. And they don't ask it because they think people will laugh at them, and then they never get their question answered. So if I have everybody write down a question and it's kind of anonymized, then they're more likely to write down their stupid question, right? As a matter of fact, sometimes in more advanced classes, I tell them, I don't care if your question is stupid, but you have to write down a question. And so it invites them to ask those questions that they're hesitating to ask because they think somebody might laugh, or maybe they're not such a smart question, but it gives them an opportunity for them. So avoid those unclear questions, especially when grammatical form doesn't match the intent. And make sure you check out the chat for all those alternate questions that people put in there. There's some great suggestions in there. So that's my tip number 3, avoid confusing, abstract, and unclear questions. So when you're doing this, though, I want to say you have to be careful about limiting responses. So if you ask, sometimes we want to make our questions easy to answer, and so we end up with very simple questions, maybe. Okay, so who won the Super Bowl in 2026? So there is only one correct answer to this question, and it is not the Patriots, right? It is the Seahawks. So once we ask this question, we have the right answer. Nobody else is going to be able to answer that question. And those types of questions don't really build interaction with our students. So when we're asking questions, think there is a place for knowledge checking and factual answers in our classrooms. We ask those all the time, but those are not the questions that we want to ask if our purpose is to get our students talking and interaction. A question like, what's your favorite food, has lots of answers. Lots of students can answer it. A question like, who won the Super Bowl? There's no room for real discussion there. So what gets students talking? Opinions, personal experiences, lots of possible answers, definitely questions that don't have a single right answer. And that's my next point. So the art of many answers, and my fourth tip is ask questions with multiple answers so that students, more than one student can answer, because then everybody has the chance to practice their language and to communicate and to interact with you and with others in your classroom. Limit those factual questions unless you're asking a lot of them. And even that is not necessarily interactive. It's just giving you a chance to interact with each student individually with those questions, right? So if you're building interaction, you want students to be able to share their opinions and their personal experiences and agree and disagree. And again, go back to that idea of food. Everybody's not going to agree on their favorite food, but they can all have something to say about it, right? Okay, so in Unit 7, which is the shopping unit in Ventures 4, I just want to point out that the first page is just a wealth of information that you can ask questions about. So the beginning of every chapter has this introductory page with a great picture. In Ventures 4, they have put in more inclusive and diverse pictures. And you could spend an entire class period just on this picture. If you can't come up with that many questions, I will tell you that the teacher book for Ventures hand feeds you questions you can ask about these pages. So there's lots of room to use these pictures. That is Ventures Level 1, but it's a fourth edition, Patricia. Okay, so let's zoom in on this picture. So we could ask questions that only have one answer, right? So I could say, how many people are in this picture? And there's only one right answer. Or I could say, what does the lady in the blue striped shirt have in her hand? And there's only one answer. But there are so many questions that we could ask that multiple students could answer. So look at this picture, and in the chat, tell me a question with multiple answers that you could ask your students. Okay, what do you see? What does she need to buy? What kinds of fruit do you like? Oh, what do you think is on her shopping list? What colors are they? What are they shopping for? What are they doing? So many questions. And you could spend so much time talking about this and giving every student a chance to participate just by the types of questions that you're asking. Okay, so when you think about the type of question you're asking, students have more opportunities to respond. So let's review those first 4 tips so far. So anytime you ask a yes/no question, be ready to follow it up with a content-seeking question. Back up when you ask a WH question and prepare students for answering it. Avoid those confusing, abstract, and unclear questions, and then try to ask questions that have multiple answers so more students get to talk. Yeah, Erica, I do think that this is probably the chapter where students talk the most, because food is such a great topic to talk about. But here's the thing. I know some of you are saying, well, I tried follow-up questions. I tried backup questions. I avoid all those confusing questions, and I offer questions with lots of answers, and I still get crickets. My students still don't respond. So I'm going to share 2 more tips with you that if you are doing all the right things with question asking, but you're not doing these 2 things, these 2 things can take you so far in giving your students the opportunity to communicate. So the next one is what I call the art of shutting up. You guys, like I said, I've been a teacher for a long time. I love to talk, and I definitely find myself at times in class talking way too much. In our classroom, our students need to be the ones talking because they need to be building their proficiency. So after you ask a question, just wait. And after you wait, then wait some more. Okay. Here's the issue. When when a fluent speaker of a language is talking with someone, so if I'm talking with someone as they're asking me a question, I am already predicting what they're going to say. And often I'm already answering their question before their question is even fully out of their mouth because I have processed their question. I know what I'm going to say, and I have predicted everything. Sometimes I'm wrong, okay? But we do this all the time. We predict, we process quickly, and we move forward. But with our ESL students need time to process the question. And they need to hear the whole question and process it through. And then they still have to have time to formulate an answer. And that takes a while. And then if you're teaching online, then they still have to have time to find the unmute button or to type it in the chat, right? So we really don't think we're waiting. We really are not waiting as long as we think we are. But it is crucial in our classroom that sometimes we just stop talking. It is important, definitely. Sometimes more in lower levels, students need that time. But as our students increase in proficiency and we start pushing them toward harder questions, they still need time to think, right? So students have to learn to communicate in English and not just learn about things. And it is so crucial for them to have the safe space in our classroom to be able to learn and to practice their skills. So my tip number 5 is just stop talking and wait. And the question I always get from teachers when I say this is, well, how long do I have to wait? So let me go ahead and say, how long do I have to wait? Well, research has shown that average teachers wait 1 or 2 seconds. And guys, let me tell you right now, in an ESL classroom, 1 or 2 seconds is not nearly long enough. Okay? English learners, again, they need all that processing time. So what I suggest is that you count to 5 in your head. And when I say count to 5, I'm not saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, right? It seems like it's so long, but it's really not that long. Students need that, right? Count to 5 in their head and then in your head, and then ask yourself, is this a complex question or a complex answer? If so, let me give them more time. Count to 5 again, okay? You might also need to ask yourself, did I ask the right question? And you might have to rephrase it, and you might have to then give them more time to be able to answer the question. It's also really important that you think about high risk. Is this high risk? Do the students risk embarrassment by answering this question? Will they feel vulnerable? And if they do, or if it's possible that they're not quite ready for this in terms of psychological safety, then that leads to the art of the quick pair and share. And this is my last tip. So sometimes students just need somebody else to tell them they have a good answer. They know an answer, but they're worried that it's wrong. And they don't want to toss it out there in front of the whole class and have the entire class laugh at them. So you can say, turn to somebody else in the class or turn to the person next to you and agree on the answer. And once they've shared that answer with somebody, they've had somebody to say, oh, that's a good answer. Are you crazy? Or I don't think that's right. And now they can talk about what the right answer is. There's power in numbers now, right? So now these two people have talked and together they came up with an answer, and it is not nearly as difficult then to toss that out in front of the class, okay? That power in numbers allows students to feel more comfortable. Donna, I'm going to come back to that online class question in just a minute. Okay, so pair them up to share. And when you pair them up to share, then students can check in with somebody else and make sure their answers are right. And then they're more willing to throw it out there and talk about it. You can do this even if you are doing written work. So lesson F in the Cambridge books is life skills, and students do life skill reading. And here's a sample questions that they might answer. So if I were going to go over this in class with my students, I might give them some time to do this on their own and then say, after you finish, check with your neighbor and make sure that your answers match. And so they can check in with their neighbor. And if their neighbor has the same answer, then hey, now both of us have it. It's probably right. And so when we go over it in class, students are more likely to throw out their answers and be willing to talk about it. I love those life skills pages as well. I think they're super helpful for students, and anything we can do to help them think about real life and not just being in the classroom is advantageous for them. Okay, so here's a final review of our tips. So those first four: follow up, back up, avoid, and ask questions with multiple answers. And then our last two: just stop talking and wait for your students, give them time to answer. And finally, pair students up to share. It gives them more confidence, and it allows them to be much more comfortable responding to your questions overall.